Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Mess. So today we're continuing the series on the MiSTer FPGA DE10 Nano project, and I found a little extra time this holiday season while my wife was wrapping up some last minute gifts for people, and I was able to squeak away and do one more testing video. That's because you guys were requesting a lot of games that I was curious about myself, so I figured I would see what was going on. Now we are doing the Turbo core today, and right off the top we're going to be taking a look at Castlevania Legacy of Darkness, because this runs in both low resolution and high resolution mode, depending on whether or not you have the 4 MB expansion installed. Obviously in an FPGA core you don't install it, it is just automatically there. But what it would do in the increase in resolution, it would totally destroy in the frame rate. This game can absolutely chug at high resolution mode. It does look prettier, but it just doesn't play the same. The great thing is here today now, this is such a smoother experience on the Turbo core. I'm not giving you guys a frame rate counter because this does run in interlaced mode, and that screws up the counter and it does not show any data whatsoever. We'll show you some frame counters in some subsequent games I test in this video, but just watch the screen cadence, just watch Cornell's arm move there, how smooth it is, and how there doesn't really seem to be much of any lag whatsoever in how the image draws. Now we're going to move over to the stock core that has these stock clock speeds for all of the chips on the Nintendo 64, and you're going to see right off the top, it is just going to start to get a little laggy. When he turns there, you can see the dip in the frame rate, you can feel it, and you can feel the speed of the game come down because of it. It's unfortunate that the frame counter doesn't work on interlaced games, but they're not frames, they're fields, so that does make sense. But again, this is a game, even in the first levels, that totally just ends up lagging on that high resolution mode. It really isn't advisable to use high res if you're on real hardware, it just makes it a slideshow in spots. But if we move over to the introductory cutscene here, synced up, overclocked on the left and stock on the right, you are going to see just how much smoother the camera motion and movements are in this introductory scene. They will get out of sync, and that is because one is running a little bit faster, and in some instances it seems like the frame rate is tied to the in-engine speed of the game. But just that swinging of the camera, the swaying, it seems to be maybe 7 to 10 frames more per second than it looks like on the stock core on the right. Now I will at some point in the future find some tools to measure this more accurately, but even here as we move forward, you can see it. Just make sure that you stare at one screen or the other. If you try to look at both at the same time, your eyes will give you an optical illusion, and you will see here soon that these two sources are going to stop syncing up right around here. But this hallway is a great example of just how smooth the motion really is. Konami did their best to make this intro look good on real hardware, and it doesn't betray how slow this game can run in actual action, but you can still see the difference in these cutscenes here and just how smooth they are. As that bridge pans around, you can rewind and watch these two sources. It just has a fluidity and a smoothness to it that you're not getting on stock core speeds. And that was the thing about the 4 MB RAM expansion pack. When it was used to do higher resolution screens, a lot of time that was at the detriment of the game's actual frame rate. And Castlevania Legacy of Darkness is a perfect example of that. And you can see it by this point in time, we're probably like 25 to 30 frames off on one source to the other. And now as we get back into the game here, this is the overclocked core, you're just going to see how fluid the motion is. Cornell's arm, the movement when you get more than one character on screen, this game is holding up much better than it ever did on the original clock speeds. It's still not going to be a perfect Lock 60 experience, but it's going to make it what I would consider playable and a very fun time versus real hardware or the stock core, which I would not advise at 4 MB RAM expansion. Now moving on to Blast Corps, big thanks to Andy D for helping me with this video. He sent a couple captures over as well, and we're going to pop that FPS overlay on. Now this game didn't lag too badly, but you're going to see here now on the overclock core, we're basically getting a locked 30 frames per second no matter what's happening on screen, even when there's explosions. You might see a frame dip, one frame right there, but that would go lower in previous cores. And the sound again is awesome and not at all affected by the overclock, so listen and I'll be right back with more games that run a lot faster. such an awesome soundtrack and such a fun game, and I love all the destructible environments here. But things like that, particle effects, destructible buildings, those are what's going to weigh on the actual engine itself when it is executing code, whether you're on real hardware, you're on FPGA. A lot of these explosions can dip the frame rate, and you're going to see here in the overclock core, sometimes it'll lose one frame depending on how big that explosion is. And on a lot of these tests, I'm either going to show you side by sides or just show you a single game, because I don't really love the frame counter as a concept. Yes, it's an empirical piece of data to explain to you what it is running at, but I am so much more interested in the motion and the cadence of the screen and the fluidity of the video in and of itself, but that's just my background as a filmmaker. But you can tell right now with the frame counter on, with all the motion on the screen, this is an absolutely fluid experience. Even with those two explosions on screen at once, we only lost one frame for maybe half a second or so. So this is another instance in which the overclock core is just going to do a better job. Now here's an example of a game that is running faster, but I'm not giving you the frame counter for because I want you to just really look at the motion and understand what it's doing. I do and don't love that frame counter. Yes, it does give you data, but people seem to rely on the number more than the feeling. A number that's high, if the frame pacing is off, doesn't really matter whatsoever. A lower number, but all of the frame pacing is correct and it has a better feel when you're playing it, is a better experience even if that frame rate would be lower. But right here in Body Harvest, fighting all of these bugs, having all of these explosions, it is again an improved experience in my opinion from the stock clock core. These are games that push the Nintendo 64 hardware to their limits in one way or another, so getting them running better is just absolutely spectacular. And that is the fun part about this entire FPGA project. First you recreate the hardware one to one, and FPGA Zoomspas is still working on that. We're going to see a lot of cores in January and February, I'm sure. But the second part is just like the PlayStation 1 core with the 2x clock speed version. Once you're done with the base hardware, you can start pivoting and making improvements. Now, I've been getting a lot of questions in comments about whether or not there could be a higher internal rendering resolution mode. I don't anticipate that, but you never know what could happen, so we will stay tuned. But if you want to see other games tested, leave me a comment down below as well. I'm definitely going to be mixing and matching new core testing videos with turbo core testing videos moving forward, treating them like they are two separate cores, because that's in fact what they are. But again, with all of these big bug models on the screen, all of these explosions, those what I assume to be acid clouds in the air, all going off at once, it is just a more fluid experience. When the camera moves around, it has a smoother swing to it, all the things that I look for when I'm looking for what a game's frame rate would be. Because even if you don't have a frame counter on a game that you are playing, you can tell and you can feel when the frame rate starts to dip. But if you do want to see more frame pacing counters at the bottom, leave me a comment down below and tell me about that, because I am thinking about maybe getting a little bit more nitty gritty on the details, but I don't want to do that work yet in case people aren't all that interested. But also, if you've never played Body Harvest before, definitely check it out. It's a really fun open world game with a lot of vehicle combat in it, and you are destroying a ton of bugs. Basically feels like Starship Troopers the game, or EDF, without those properties being involved. And if you're an EDF fan, let me know as well. I love that franchise, and I'm probably going to do a video on it at some point in 2024. But again, this overclock core just makes some games feel like they are a better experience. But interestingly enough, in other games, it's really not going to make much of a fundamental difference in areas in which you might be playing. We're going to move over to Shadowgate 64, and I do have the frame counter on. First, we're going to be doing the overclock core, and you're going to see that this introductory cutscene in Engine, where you do not have control whatsoever, is at a locked 15 frames per second. That is going to be faster than the next source, which I'm going to let you listen to the audio as well. But it does make the fluidity of the character models seem better, and it just is a better experience. Although 15 frames per second in this game, because it moves slow, feels good, but generally would not be considered a good frame rate across any sort of game whatsoever. But the interesting thing is that when we move over to the stock clock core, you're going to see a difference in the frame rate. So look at that counter, listen to this audio because it is quite interesting, and I'll be back and show you what the frame rate is in game. I love that Shadowgate has such an austere soundtrack in spots, but if you didn't notice on that frame counter, it is 12 frames per second locked, so that is a 25% uptick in the frame rate on the overclock core. But interestingly, right here as we go from overclock to stock cores, in the actual gameplay, at least in the sewers, they are both 15 frames per second, so it doesn't seem like the overclock core is doing anything to fundamentally help the gameplay. Now that might be different further into the game, but I don't have an infinite amount of time to test these really far through. But this seems to be an instance in which in the cutscenes the overclock core is definitely benefiting the overall performance, getting you those 3 extra frames. But as we go from overclock to stock core here and jump in the same body of water, you're going to see that the frame rate is identical. So Shadowgate 64 seems to be one game that a lot of people wanted to see tested, and one that unfortunately doesn't seem to be having much of a change. And moving over to Mega Man 64, big thanks to Insane Friend for sharing this footage. This right here is the stock core. You're going to see that there's going to be dips down into the 20s, especially when that robot claps his hands on screen. You can almost get down into the high teens as well. It wants to lock at 30, but it struggles to maintain that. As we move over to the overclock core, you're going to see that 30 frames per second only goes down to 29 every once in a while, but for the most part, it is maintaining that rock solid stable 30 frames per second. And you can see it in the footage as well. When Mega Man 64 slows down, so does the game and so does the cadence of the video that you're watching. Let's move back over to the stock core with these stock clock speeds and watch the motion as well. You're going to see that we're getting into the teens there for a moment until it comes back up to 30, but that explosion right there brought it all the way down to 15 frames per second, and the game slowed down because of it. Now at 15 frames a second, Mega Man 64 is not in any way, shape, or form unplayable, but this is another game that's going to see a massive benefit on the overclock core, and that's why it is so interesting. It is just a smoother experience all around, and we're still on overclocked here just for the end of the fight, but again, watch how the camera swings and moves. It wants to maintain that 30 frames per second, and 99% of the time it is able to do that. It's only every once in a while that you get 1 frame dips, and even all of these explosions and missiles on screen are keeping everything exactly where they should be in the frame rate. The more that draws on screen, the more there is a risk of the frame rate dropping, but at least in this instance in Mega Man on the overclock core, it is fine. Now in the overworld area here on the overclock core, as the camera swings around and as Mega Man moves around, you're going to see that it is at a lock 30 again, and this is a weird instance in the game where it does like to dip the frame rate even on the overclock core. When you talk to the inspector here, it is going to go down to 27 frames per second. Now let's move over to Insane Friend's capture of the stock clock core, and you're going to see that the camera just swinging around dips all the way down to 15 frames per second. It is laggy, the cadence on the screen is definitely choppy. This is not a super enjoyable experience. Even when you talk to people, it's going to have these same issues. So this is another game, Mega Man 64, in which the overclock core is great, because even talking to the inspector there, that is a locked 15 frames per second. That's what it dips to. But that's the bonus episode for the Turbo Core testing. Like I said, I had a little extra time before I had to stop working for my holiday break, so I figured I'd knock one more video out to give you a full week of afternoon videos on Nintendo 64 before we move into 2024. But it's been a hell of a year for MiSTer FPGA. It's been an even bigger hell of a year for Nintendo 64, and now that we have a Turbo Core, we now have 2 competing cores we can test on, and that is going to be a lot of fun for the next year. Share that, leave me a comment down below, just tell me what you want to see tested next. I'm definitely going to keep up with this Turbo Core. Hope everyone's having a great holiday, I hope you have a happy new year, and I will see you guys in 2024. Bye bye.